So I was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, and there's a story in there he tells where he was talking to his eighth grade teacher. And at that time, I guess Malcolm was a really smart kid in the class. He might have even been one of the tops in the class as far as academics, popularity, that type of thing. So his teacher and Malcolm and his teacher are talking, and the teacher says, "Hey, Malcolm, have you started thinking about what you want to be in life?" And Malcolm said, "Yeah, I did. I have started thinking about it." And he says, "Well, what do you want to be?" He says, "Well, I want to be a lawyer." And from what Malcolm says, the teacher sat back in his chair and he he laughed. And Malcolm says, "Hey, what are you laughing at?" And the teacher says to him, well, Malcolm, you ought to think about being something that he called him the N-word. You ought to think about being something that a black can do in life that's more realistic for being a black. Being a lawyer is not something a black can do in life. You should think about being working with your hands. You should think about being a janitor. You should think about being a landscaper. You should think about being a waiter. You should think about being a cook. Because being something like a lawyer that's not something that a black person is basically, it's out of your league. It's not permitted. It's not something that it's going to be possible for you. So here's my thing that I thought about this situation. Let's say that this teacher dealt with, let's say there were 5 other black kids in the class and 20 white kids in the class. Okay, so all the white kids are allowed to are pushed towards this cup right here. Let's say this cup represents doctors, it represents teachers, it represents nurses, it represents engineers, it represents owners of businesses, it represents attorneys, things like that. People going into scientific fields, astronauts, aerospace engineers. This cup over here, let's say the teacher pushed all of the black kids to this cup. Okay, shoe shine boys, landscapers. He said, work with your hands, working at the sawmill, cleaning up, janitorial staff, that type of thing. Now, let's say over a 30-year career, this teacher deals with, let's just say, 5 black kids a year. So over a 30-year period, this teacher in his career would have pushed 150 black kids to this cup to be basically workers who would not be like engineers, doctors, lawyers. He would encourage them to go to this cup. Now, let's say 20 kids per year for 30 years for white kids. He would have pushed that many white kids to go to this cup, to be lawyers, to be doctors, to be engineers, to be people who were like in charge, basically, the principals of the school, the teachers, the nurses, the CEO of the hospital, that type of thing. So let's take that same example, and let's say that in that school that teacher worked at, let's say that the school as a whole had that mentality. So over a 30-year period, the school is creating graduates, black graduates, that are all being pushed to this cup. And let's say that over a 30-year period, they're pushing all the white kids to this cup. Okay, what happens? What if the school district as a whole had that mentality? So let's say there was 5 other schools in the district and they had that mentality. That means that school district is creating a black population that is being pushed to this cup, a white population that is being pushed to this cup. Okay, so what would that town look like after a 30-year period? Who would be like in the positions of authority to be in charge? Who would be the people who would be employed, who would be just working for someone else? Okay, not saying that these aren't good jobs, that you couldn't have a career, but these aren't like, these won't be, in many cases, as high paying as these jobs here. Now, what if the entire city had that mentality? Blacks go to this cup, whites go to this cup. What if a whole country had that mentality? Blacks go to the blue cup, whites go to the cup, the cup with all the colors on it that represents doctors, it represents lawyers, it represents scientists, it represents astronauts, it represents engineers, it represents heads of businesses. The blue cup, janitors, shoe shine boys, waiters, waitresses, nurse aides, things like that. So what if a system like that existed for 300 years, 400 years, that created people who, what if the system was that created so that one group went to this cup and one group went to this cup? What would that do to a country? What would that look like? And now that we go into this day and age, a lot of people are talking about this equity and inclusion. A lot of companies are doing these trainings. I believe that this example that Malcolm X was, that I illustrated for you, that he writes in his book, is the reason why we are now trying to go back and break systems that were created. Okay, there were systems that were created that advantaged one group and disadvantaged the other. And now in this day and age, we're going back and trying to fix and hem and break things that have been in existence for hundreds and hundreds of years. And this is why it's so difficult, because it's been that way for so long. It's hard for people to see that. But that was just one example that I wanted to point out to you of the reason why we need to focus on this equity inclusion training, because we can see that if just that one teacher in his career alone, he was pushing one group to one side and one group to the other. What if the whole city was thinking like that? What if the whole country was thinking like that? What would happen? What would happen if that was the mentality of the entire country for hundreds and hundreds of years? Thanks for listening.